Hey, good morning, and thanks for joining us today. This is IRS Medic. I am Anthony Parent, and joining me today is Keith Redmond, the advocate to and consulate to the American abroads, and also the man known around the world, the great John Richardson. And John has once again he's created some slides for today's presentation. I just went through them. He was answering all the issues I was hoping we would get to. Just fantastic. I really want to thank John. You know, we did get a great compliment and on our podcast here. And really from Parvez, we got this great comment. I really appreciate it. He made U.S. tax law discussions kind of fun and entertaining. Well, again, I'm not doing it alone. I really appreciate what John does here, because I was talking with Parvez a little bit more. Do we want to go with the snappy content or go in depth with it? And, you know, basically John has held me hostage, and he won't let me do any clickbait, but rather we have to go deep into the issues. And I'm actually enjoying it a lot more, because one of the great benefits of doing this is my education. My education is constantly increasing, and I do thank John.
Yeah, same here.
So much for So John, thank you so much for educating. Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
Just a little bit of entertainment here or humor. Please make sure when you say Americans abroad that you say Americans abroad. Sometimes it comes off that I'm an advocate for American broads.
American broads, the top. The advocate for American broads, Keith Redmond. There we go. I'll get you some business cards for that, Keith.
There you go.
All right, fantastic. All right, well, let's get into this. And really, this is incredibly timely. I was actually talking to someone yesterday about renunciation of U.S. citizenship, and you know, the exit tax came up, and Puerto Rico came up. He's got some friends there, and it's a place that people go. But for a lot of people, it's just a no-go. It's a no-go. But for some people, it's the right thing. And so here we're going to kind of figure out what's it good for, but what it really won't really help you with. And also, if you are in Puerto Rico, you have worldwide income. Yeah, we'll get into that anyway. So let's get going right into it. John, thank you so much for joining us today. You ready for this? All right, let's get going. First slide. Here we go. Now, this is a book you were telling us about earlier, and I think I really need to read it here. So go ahead, John. Explain what this is about.
Yeah, you do need to read it, but here's the thing, okay? I do not believe that the Puerto Rico issue can be understood without the context of history and that. So I just want to start off a little bit. I mean, all it's going to do is make people aware that there is a context to this, etc. So I'm just going to kind of gloss over this. But the reason I like the Daniel Immerwahr book, okay, he's a professor somewhere in the Midwest, I believe. It's really a great book, and I recommend it to everybody. Because what he points out is that what people think is the United States is actually not really the United States. I mean, it's part of the United States. So you look at the map, that's the continental United States. Oddly enough, that doesn't even include Alaska, Hawaii, right? The one on the left. But if you look at the right, so that includes Alaska, Hawaii, but it also includes various U.S. territories and possessions, right? Now, territories and possessions are, well, they're not states. Otherwise, they'd be called states.
Right.
And at one time, I think, well, I know for sure, I'm just not clear on the terminology. I mean, Hawaii, I think, only became a state sometime around the mid-last century.
1959.
There you go.
So before that, I guess it was a territory or possession as well. But anyway, just, you know, that's important, okay, for context. Let's continue on here.
All right.
That's a shout out for the author. A video with Democracy Now! Great discussion for anybody who's interested. Next.
Right. And it's so right there. I mean, it's just sort of an absurd thing. You have parts of the United States that aren't states.
Well, that's right. Okay. So, I mean, some highlights on Puerto Rico, and some of this would apply to other, you know, territories, possessions as well, but it's not a U.S. state. It's a U.S. possession or territory. And I put it that way because we're going to go to the Internal Revenue Code in just a bit, right? Historically, it was, you know, part of the whole Spanish War thing in the late 1898 or something like that. You know, the U.S. inherits this from Spain.
Inherit's an interesting word, I would say. That's an interesting choice of word, right? Inherits.
How the U.S. government would put it.
Right. Yeah. Oh, well, they just gave it to us for no reason at all, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's interesting about it, there's a whole fascinating body of law here, and I just want to draw people's attention to it without really, we can't discuss it. But, so you've got the states, you got the territories, and the question is, what are the laws that would apply to these territories? There's a whole series of cases called the insular cases that basically plant the seeds to differentiate the legal basis, right, for territories versus states. And this reared its ugly head again in 2022. Bottom line is, okay, that to get in the history, some of these were called unincorporated, which means they were never intended to be absorbed into the United States. And for this group, really, they don't get U.S. constitutional protections. And an incredible reminder of that is the 2022 case of United States Valo Merdea, if I'm pronouncing it properly. It's an extraordinary case where a Puerto Rican who was living, a U.S. citizen from Puerto Rico, was living in New York, was getting some sort of Social Security type of benefit. And by moving to Puerto Rico, he actually lost his legal entitlement to the benefit because he moved to Puerto Rico. The IRS the U.S. government also sued him for a refund of, something. You imagine somebody who can't put together two nickels gets sued by the U.S. government for $27,000-$30,000. Court, I recommend Gorsuch's dissent to all. But in any case, moving on. My point here is that this is not like a U.S. state. Okay, this is an entirely different animal with entirely different rules, etc. But next slide.
Well, let me just welcome people who are joining us. I'm here with Keith Redmond and John Richardson. We are talking today about Puerto Rico and the potential solutions, but issues with it. Right now, we're going through a little bit of the history of Puerto Rico, and it's sort of the foundations to really understand what it is. And, John, what you're saying right here is, now I really see it. As you're talking, I'm really seeing it that the United States of America, the federal government, created its own super state. It's created its own super state to rule over parts that aren't states, but it also rules over states as well. That's what this really seems like. We have this federal government creating the super state with its own creation, but don't ask them to actually honor parts of the Constitution because they're going to pick and choose. So it seems like the government's going to pick and choose what laws they want to have.
Yeah, in this case, the issue is whether individuals in Puerto Rico are entitled to the same constitutional rights, such as they may be.
Such as they may be.
I sort of analogize a little more to, the United States would behave more like an occupying army. Okay.
Right.
But anyway, moving on.
I think that's a fair.
Yeah.
That's basically what it is. We are one big standing army, right on.
Now,
okay.
One thing that I think is very interesting here, and important to understand in the context, that since 1941 at least, anybody born in Puerto Rico is a U.S. citizen. Okay, and I want to repeat that. Okay, people born in Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens. Now that's interesting, as we start talking about U.S. citizenship taxation. Okay, so in a minute, what we're going to see is that basically a carve out to worldwide taxation is for bona fide residents of Puerto Rico. So let's say we have a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico as a U.S. citizen. He may not have to pay U.S. tax on his Puerto Rican income while he lives in Puerto Rico, but if he leaves Puerto Rico, then all of a sudden, he's taxed on his worldwide income. And I had an exchange about a year ago with somebody on Twitter who was absolutely shocked by this. But in any case, moving on.
Yeah, and just to clarify that if you are in Puerto Rico and your income is sourced outside of Puerto Rico, worldwide taxation applies to you. It does. It most certainly does. And we've done some streamlined disclosures for people caught up by this sort of intricacy. They didn't understand they weren't investing in the U.S. It was, maybe they had investments in the Caribbean all around there. And they didn't know that they had to report it. You file a 1040 NR to pay taxes on your worldwide income when you are in Puerto Rico, even though the territory exempts you from taxation. That's where we are right now.
Well, we'll get to how the carve out works in a second. Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Now, interestingly, yesterday I sometimes answer questions on Quora, and magically, in anticipation of this question appeared on Quora. So,
oh my God! Wow.
For a second.
I hit the link. Oh, I don't know if I can. Oh yeah, I can. Look at that. Hey, look at that. All right, awesome.
So is it possible for an immigrant to become a Yeah, here, hold on a minute. It's possible for an immigrant to become a U.S. citizen without paying taxes. Are there exceptions or loopholes? So I answered this. I thought I'd throw it in the presentation here, right? Assuming your question is there any exceptions or loopholes to U.S. citizens being subject to the rules in the Internal Revenue Code? No exceptions. Okay, these rules define U.S. citizens as individuals are always subjects of the Internal Revenue Code. Always, a U.S. citizen is always
Always is
governed by the Internal Revenue Code, and that is, by the way, why the only fix for this problem is severing U.S. citizenship from tax residency completely. These carve-outs will do nothing. They keep people subject to the Internal Revenue Code. Maybe they change the circumstance of it, but that's it. In any case, no exceptions. Now, some loopholes, though, that result in the exclusion of income. So no U.S. tax is paid. Now, this is interesting. So we start off with U.S. citizens who live in the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico are not subject to taxation on certain Puerto Rico source income. Let's just keep going down. There are other ones that don't apply to Puerto Rico, but I think the principle is interesting. U.S. citizens who meet the requirements of the foreign earned income exclusion, right? You know, there's another kind of exclusion.
Oh yeah, right. Yep.
Generally available to everybody. You know, somewhat different, right? We have foreign tax credit rules. We have treaties. For example, the Canada-U.S. tax treaty would exempt U.S. citizens living in Canada from taxation, U.S. taxation on Social Security. But believe me, they'll pay enough of tax in Canada. And there probably are other loopholes, carve-outs, etc. But the key point is there's no exception to the principle of U.S. citizenship taxation. And as we know, the U.S. is the only country, modern country, that abuses its citizens in this way. But now let's think about that for a minute, right? Because once again, I want to emphasize, and re-emphasize that U.S. citizens are always, and green card holders, by the way, U.S. citizens are always tax residents of the United States. It's just that in certain circumstances, there may be exclusions from the income they have to pay tax on. And I cannot overemphasize how much I therefore believe that the only solution to this problem is severing citizenship from tax residency altogether. You know, all these other half-ass proposals are, you know, they're
Well, yeah, and John, that's exactly why I would say it will never be done, because the whole purpose of the tax code is to destroy humanity. And that what you're and that you know, we don't really even have it's not even a revenue raising system. We have a command and control structure. That's what this is. So I don't think by the way, severing citizenship from taxation would be a solution. Therefore, it will never be done. Not by Washington, D.C. No way. This is what they want. And and we only see more of the abuse from people who don't have representation in Congress. So.
Well, I think, yeah, we'll see. But I mean, I think the key point here is that the efforts need to be towards severing citizenship from tax residency and not things that wouldn't solve the problem. But anyway, moving on.
Right. Yeah, right. Okay.
All right, now, given that a large part of our audience is U.S. citizens living outside the United States, I want to compare and contrast two U.S. citizens. The first is a U.S. citizen living in, say, France, who has only U.S. source income. Only French source income, That U.S. citizen living in France, which is a sovereign country, is subject to U.S. taxation on his or her French source income. You with me?
Yep.
But let's go to Puerto Rico, and we'll see why in a minute. A U.S. citizen, maybe his brother, moves to Puerto Rico, has only Puerto Rican source income, you know, as long as he or she meets the bona fide residence test, will not be taxable on that Puerto Rican income. So we have this very interesting situation. If we look at it comparatively, where somebody who moves to a U.S. territory, right, you know, part of the United States in some way or another, is not taxable on income sourced in that territory, but yet somebody who moves to a sovereign country is taxed on that income sourced in that sovereign country. I mean, let's pause for a minute and let that sink in. Do you not find that shocking?
Shocking, but not surprising. Yeah.
Keith Redmond, you're familiar with the depravity of our government, though, right? It's not shocking once you know what it is. Once
Or
you know, yeah.
yeah, or
Okay.
surprising, not shocking. It's what you know what I mean. It's just
But I think it should be kept in mind, for people who are trying to get these laws changed, right? Because this is interesting, right? It's an interesting fact. I don't think it's an insignificant fact. I'm not entirely sure what the best way to use it is because I think the response might be, well, you moved to Puerto Rico too, right? But it is interesting nevertheless, particularly given the fact that it's imposing taxation on income source in a sovereign country and excluding income source from a U.S. territory. I mean, why not simply pass a law that anybody who's a resident of California doesn't have to pay tax on income source in California, right?
Yeah. California has a bigger economy, so that would actually be that's sort of one of the problems that you have with Puerto Rico. So you have to be there, and you're limited you're limited where your income sources can come
Well,
from.
but say you have the same rule for California. Anybody's a bona fide resident of California. I mean, I'm just pointing out that
Yeah.
this is
Well, you have to deal with California taxes. Still.
yeah, but they're not as bad as
Yeah, they're
yes.
not as bad, right?
It's the question of
Well, not necessarily. Oftentimes, we run into various situations where someone with income abroad, their California state taxes are higher than their federal taxes. It does happen a few times. We see it again and again. So that is, you picked the winner out there on the West Coast there. That is really interesting.
Well, either way, I mean, the issue is the federal taxation. But anyway, let's
Yeah.
move on here.
Let's move on here. Yeah, moving on.
Okay, now I want to look at this today, but that's the background. I want to look at this in terms of 4 parts. Okay, the taxation of bona fide residents of Puerto Rico, that's U.S. The magic is in the bona fide residence test. But part 3, I want to talk about how Puerto Rico taxes this, and finally, a small conclusion. But see, the way a tax haven works, the way most people think about a tax haven is that you move to a country that doesn't have taxes, right? And so what we have here, part 1, I'll explain why for bona fide residents, Puerto Rico source income is excluded from U.S. taxation. It's as though there were no citizenship taxation. It becomes a form of residency-based taxation, doesn't it, right? But then when you become a resident of Puerto Rico and you enroll in one of these tax incentive programs in Puerto Rico, you end up paying very, very little tax, okay, just because Puerto Rico doesn't impose much tax. So, that's sort of the structure of what we're looking at. Now, let's take a look at part 1, moving down here, U.S. taxation of bona fide residents. And again, Puerto Rico there. Now, we always start with the Internal Revenue Code, always, okay, which is where nobody starts, right? Much better to read some half-assed article and read the actual source. But anyway,
Yeah.
So here we go. Now let's go through this. The general rule says the following item shall not be included in gross income and shall be exempted from taxation under this subtitle. Now, that is the income tax subtitle, right? So whatever follows is going to be exempt from gross income under the U.S. income tax laws. Now, this is not the same thing as Social Security laws, right? Or a state and gift tax or something. This is under the income tax laws. Resident of Puerto Rico for an entire taxable year. In the case of an individual, now I've highlighted the key language, bona fide resident during the entire taxable year, income derived from sources within Puerto Rico. There's a bit of a carve out, right? But etc. I mean, that's really the key point here, right? Okay, so bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, income sources within Puerto Rico. Okay, now as you can imagine, the issue is whether you're a bona fide resident or not. So,
Yeah, that's a trick there, huh?
That's defined in Internal Revenue Code 937, but mostly you'd be amazed how much more there is in the regs than in the actual statute here. But
I mean,
basically, or maybe you wouldn't. Here's what they're saying. Now, I want you to notice, for the purpose of this subpart, once they start talking about 865, for example, 865 is part of the sourcing rules. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute, because remember, the income has to be sourced in Puerto Rico. But you meet the bona fide resident test if you're present for at least 183 days during the taxable year. Notice that they're applying this rule to all of the possessions or territories, right?
yeah, yeah.
Samoa, etc. But not all of these are equivalent tax regimes. You have to not have a tax home. Now, notice here they're referencing 911. That's the foreign earned income exclusion. Okay. And you don't have a closer connection to the United States. So what they've done here is they're saying, all right, 183 days, however that's defined, then they're backstopping that with other features in the U.S. tax code. You can't have a tax home, etc., in the United States, and you can't have a closer connection. So, in summary, what that means is that you got to be really living in Puerto Rico.
Right.
Okay, I mean, you're going to have.
That's what it means, right? And that's the limiter right there. Yeah.
Now, I didn't put the regs in here particularly, but if you go to the regs, there's a lot more detail. And I can tell you that any discussion of this, if somebody's serious about this, that does not focus primarily on the regs, you're just setting yourself up for failure. Okay. Next.
And that, I mean, that is, I think, one of the biggest problems with this is that this needs to be part of your life. If you're going to do this, your life is totally going to change. Your center of life has to become Puerto Rico. Otherwise, you're not really going to satisfy the bona fide resident test.
This is not, okay. Let me put it this way. There are a lot of ways you can trip and screw this up. All right. And I think there's some people who would be okay with this, but I actually think that a majority of people are not interested in having their lives micromanaged to this extent. Okay. But in any case.
Well, and the thought that I have is when I think about this is like, well, you're leaving one prison, U.S. citizenship taxation, for a prettier prison. It's nicer, but you're committing to this, and that's going to impact what you want. That may really impact what you want to do later in your life, that you're allowing your tax decisions to impact you to define your life. And I would say I would recommend against that. I actually would recommend against doing that. It doesn't work out. If it's not something sustainable, it won't be sustained.
Well, notice that, the problem is always citizenship taxation. Okay. I think you're far better off renouncing U.S. citizenship than moving to Puerto Rico. All right. Well,
right. Yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with Puerto Rico, but being forced to stay in
right.
Puerto Rico,
Right.
being forced to stay and having to make sure that your income is sourced in Puerto Rico. But anyway, I mean, there are people who would disagree, but whatever. Let's move on. Now,
Right.
Here we go. Sources in Puerto Rico. Now, basically what this does, it says provide in paragraph 2, rules similar to the rules for determining whether income is income within the United States or, is going to be applied to Puerto Rico. What this means is that you basically go to the sourcing rules and pretend that Puerto Rico is the United States. But in any case, I want to talk about this in the context. You asked the question about capital gains and crypto. We'll focus more on that. Next. Yeah. Okay, here's your sourcing rules. Basically, the income cannot be sourced in the United States. Okay, it's got to be sourced in Puerto Rico. And the part of the code that generally governs this is right there. We're going to focus a little bit on source rules for personal property sales because individual shares are personal property and crypto is personal property. That's what most people are interested in. Okay, so next. Okay, this is. There's a bunch of stuff for you to read, more IRS publications, etc., that make this more granular. But I don't see any way to take a really, really deep dive into this in a short podcast, right? Other than to make the point that you got to be a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico. The income exclusion is going to be an income source in Puerto Rico. Generally, the U.S. sourcing rules will govern that. Okay, generally, but you need to be very careful. Next slide. Now,
Here we go. Yeah.
here we go. Now, this is probably not understood very well by most people because it requires reading and understanding various parts of the code here. But so if you have a tax home in Puerto Rico, it means the gains. Now we're talking about the sale capital gains on property, right? Generally speaking, in the world of tax, capital gains are sourced to the country of residence of the person receiving the gain, generally speaking, okay? So the question here is, a U.S. citizen moves to Puerto Rico and has capital gains. Are those gains going to be sourced to Puerto Rico or not? Now, the general answer is going to be yes. Now, why is that? Okay, because if you go to basically the rules for tax home in the United States, if you're a U.S. citizen, capital gains can be sourced outside the United States as long as your tax home is outside the United States, right? And you recall that if you're a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, that includes having a tax home not in the United, outside the United States. So the general rule is that the sale of personal property, gains on property, shares, crypto, etc. The general rule is that it's going to be sourced where you're living in Puerto Rico, right? Which would mean that it should be excluded from U.S. taxation. However,
Yeah.
okay,
This
there
right
are
here.
a number of exceptions here. And if you want to go to the next slide,
Yeah, and I would say that, John, right there, that the capital gain will apply to the part of the gain that was accrued before the individual moved to Puerto Rico. There's your little.
Well, what that means is that people who have incurred large unrealized capital gains while living in the United States are not going to be able to move to Puerto Rico and avoid taxation.
Right. This is not something where you're a crypto investor. I want to avoid my capital gains. I'll become a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, start selling it. Okay, great. But again, that doesn't do too much for your taxes. You have to pay the part of the gain that accrued before.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it didn't do much. And now, of course, you always could say, hey, well, look, I just won't comply. Well, I'm like, well, if you're just not going to comply, maybe there's a lot easier ways to do it than going to Puerto Rico, just like no comply. So you're kind of,
Actually, this is very much like certain exit tax regimes, right?
Right. It's a soft exit tax regime because you're not renouncing your citizenship, but we're gonna get you an exit tax in a way. They're gonna do it, right?
Okay. Anyway, the bottom line is simply this: be careful. You certainly cannot accrue a bunch of gains in the United States, move to Puerto Rico, and sell and avoid U.S. capital gains tax. As a general principle, there are even some carve-outs for this. If you move to Puerto Rico, buy some stuff, accrue capital gain while a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, then you're going to be generally okay. Generally, but you really have got to get appropriate advisors here. Now, a couple of really great articles on this. First one, didn't know where else to put it, but there's a law professor at the University of Nevada, Francine Redmond, writes incredible stuff. Okay. And this is her latest article on the whole issue of Puerto Rican tax rules. And there we go. How many downloads? 109 downloads. Well, that's typical of such a fantastic article. Who would read something so great? But if you want to I mean, very few of your viewers I know would really want to understand the history of this, but this is a fantastic source if you do. And frankly, I think if you're a lawyer practicing in this area, you really ought to read this because context matters. Okay, the second.
Yeah, and here it is right there. That you know what? And I'm just sort of I'm laughing in my head because there's something, there's a theme, John, that we've been saying for years. And this part here, I'm just going to outline because I think I have something to say at the end that sort of goes along with this. U.S. Supreme Court reaffirms the disparate treatment of Puerto Rican residents. And that word disparate, right? Different, treating differently. That's the thing that I want to focus on, but later on, but we'll move on.
Oh, well, that's exactly right. And that's that case that I was talking about, the 2000.
Right. Yeah.
I recommend that people read Justice Gorsuch's dissent, where he essentially says, this is indescribable bullshit, and it should be struck down for equal protection reasons. But
well, there you go, and John, that's the point that I'm trying to get to. Is I'm just shaking my head, laughing at the absurdity of this. That the Fifth Amendment itself does not say the government must provide equal protection under the law. Rather, what it says is due process. Inherent in due process is that you treat people equally. Well, what is the U.S. tax system other than treating everyone as differently as possible? It starts off with the very beginning of it. You're taxed this way if you're single, this way if you're widowed, this way if you're married, but not filing the same, this way if you're married and filing together. It starts off with this foundation of a complete ignoring the Fifth Amendment. And that's why we have been saying for years, the true Constitution of the United States is its tax code, which isn't even really true because the U.S. tax code includes far more things than just its tax code. It's the publishes and also, and the other thing that includes the U.S. tax code, John, is this. What the tax industry says it is, because we've seen time and time again where the tax industry, with perhaps good reasons, creates the law out of thin air. Or not out of thin air, but creates the law out of anxiety and the vagueness the IRS intentionally or unintentionally, probably a combination of both, presents to us. So that's the entire point as we're going through this. As we're actually going through this, right? You could see the U.S. Supreme Court in the summary reaffirms the disparate treatment of Puerto Rican residents. Wait a second. Are Puerto Rican residents U.S. citizens? Yes. Since 1941, everyone born is a citizen. Well, how should we treat them? Totally different. Totally different than anybody else. Is that Constitution? Yes. Why? Because it's taxes. Because it's taxes, right? The place where we need the constitutional protections the most, because these affect the most amount of people, is where the Supreme Court ignores it the most, with the exception of Judge Gorsuch, apparently. So,
well,
okay.
This case was not so much disparate treatment in terms of taxation. It was just disparate treatment because it's a territory. But in any case, I've really come to, over the years, I've come to see, I think, a couple things, at least a couple things. The first is that 90% of what goes on in the world is a result of tax laws.
Yes.
I mean, you remember the boxing match between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman in Africa?
Yes.
74. I don't know if you were around. Anyway, well, there was one in 70. Whatever.
Well, actually, I was a little too young to actually watch it. I was alive.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. In any case, yeah. I mean, these are important world events, but I mean, it was totally driven by taxation, right? I mean, why do these things never take place in the United States? Because of the high tax burden.
Yeah.
On the profits. But see, here's the thing, right? Because taxation is so pervasive and because tax codes are no longer about taxation, basically the barometer of the individual rights in a country is directly proportional to the rights they have under the tax code.
Right.
I mean, it's so obvious, right?
Right.
So, for the U.S., I mean, the tax code operates outside the Constitution. It is possibly, the Internal Revenue Code may very well be the most extensive compilation of human rights violations, possibly since, I don't know, the blueprint for some of the worst regimes in history.
No, I think we are the worst regime in history. I don't think we're in a position where we could judge any other regimes. I really don't. When you know what this government does, what it claims to be, what it actually is, we're not in any position to judge other regimes. I'm sorry, we're just not. Because when you're doing this, when you're creating, and this is the entire point of the U.S. tax code. It's a psyop to demoralize us. It's actually not a revenue raising entity. It's disguised as that. What it is, it's the other part of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve creates the money, hands it out to their buddies. The IRS takes away the money from the people who are the enemies of the state. That's what it works. It's not about raising revenue. It's not about paying your taxes for roads. It's not even about paying your taxes for the military. The military gets everything it needs from the Federal Reserve. But now what will happen if we don't if we don't start destroying dollars, we'll get hyperinflation. Right? We have inflation right now, and the only way to bring inflation down is to kill dollars with ruinous taxes. And no surprise, the proposals now are for the most ruinous taxes, which has to be because so much money was created. That's what this really is. We're lied to about what it is. And that's why I don't think we're in any position whatsoever to adjudicate any regime. And in fact, when people say this is what absolutely drives me nuts. The United States of America is a banana republic. That's what people will say. It's like, that's absolutely insane. The United States of America is the entity that created banana republics. We are the ones who did it. And we will say, well, look at that banana republic. We're the ones who did it. We're judging them. And now, of course, our chickens come home to roost, and we shouldn't be so surprised because, hey, look, it's policy. Hey, we could affect elections around the world. We could overthrow elections around the world because, hey, those are the U.S. interests. Those are the U.S. interests. And these values are all reflected. All these values, how the government looks at you, are all reflected in all these laws, which you could possibly never understand or read if you had the time or the intelligence to do so. It's confusion by intent. It's confusion to keep us down. And really the point of this podcast is to expose this because, hey, look, you guys, you're locked in with us, IRS. You want to go down this road? You want to have these complications? Well, guess what? You better have the brain power to keep up with us. Because we're going down this road. You're locked in with us because that's what this is about. So let's move on.
Well, in any case, until the Internal Revenue Code is subjected to the kinds of constraints that are found in most human rights documents around the world, the U.S. citizens will never, ever, ever have any rights at all. I mean, they are owned lock, stock, and barrel.
Absolutely.
By the Internal Revenue Code, but we know that. Next. Now, here's something that is a very interesting problem, and I received messages from people asking about this, and so the idea is right that somebody would move to Puerto Rico and they have these assets, and if a deemed capital gain would be sourced to Puerto Rico, could they renounce and not pay an exit tax, for example? I have not worked out in my mind what the answer to that is. Right now, clearly, to the extent that the gains accrued before the person moved to Puerto Rico, no, the answer would be clearly no, right?
Right.
But let's imagine a situation where you go to Puerto Rico, you stay for 10 years, you're clearly a bona fide resident. You've accrued gains of, a lot over a 10-year period. You're a covered expatriate. And let's say you renounce. Now, here's the question, right? Does the fact that the gains are sourced in Puerto Rico and therefore, if the assets were actually sold, not subject to the U.S.
Oh, okay. I see. Yeah, all right. I got your point. Yeah.
In the case of a deemed sale, the same rule applies. Now,
John, I want to interrupt for a second because I'm confused on one point. When you say let's say you renounce, you mean renounce while living in Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
Or can you do that?
Yeah.
You leave Puerto Rico, so you're outside the United States.
Okay.
You actually renounce. I mean, my point is,
I'm just
renouncing during a period where you're a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, right? I mean,
gotcha.
You don't have to be there every second. Now, here's the problem. Move down a little bit. Next slide. Now, this probably is the most important part of our discussion this morning. The best thing I'm going to be able to do is give you a warning. I've really not thought my way through this. Okay, but if we look at 877A, so we have a deemed sale and expatriation, general rules, mark to market, all property recovered shall be treated as sold the day before the expatriation date. Okay, so, so you're a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico. You wouldn't pay tax, but were actually sold. But take a look at 2A. Look at that language. Notwithstanding any other provision of this title, meaning Title 26. Notwithstanding any other provision
What?
of this title,
Whoa.
gain arising from such sale shall be taken into account for the taxable year of sale. Now, so Section 933 is clearly a provision in the Internal Revenue Code, isn't it?
It is. Yes, it is. Right, exactly. So
Let's say we read that, notwithstanding Section 933 of the Internal Revenue Code, any gain arising shall, I don't know. I'd be careful. Okay.
that,
You need to get help on this because expatriation is always a minefield.
well, this is something that I was just thinking of because crypto guys, the ones who are successful, they're really brilliant and they think about things. They really think about things, and these guys are smart, and they'll come back to you with some proposals that will really impressive. But one thing is like, okay, well, let's talk about, okay, let's say that you're that Bitcoin investor, and you say, okay, look, I get it. I have to pay, I won't be able to get out of capital gains by moving to Puerto Rico on what has built up. So like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to sell all my crypto right now. I'm going to sell all my crypto. I'm going to convert it all to USD. Go ahead and do that. I'm going to pay this final year of US taxes, going to pay the capital gains on that. Now, as soon as I'm in Puerto Rico, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go buy as much crypto as I can go back as I can. So then the question becomes in my mind is, well, is that personal property Puerto Rican sourced? Is that Puerto Rican sourced income, or is it global income? And it would probably be global because you're buying it on a global exchange. I'm imagining, and this seems
No,
like
that's not what determines. That's not how the source rules work.
okay. So how would the source rules work on?
On personal property, not where you buy, but where you're resident.
Okay,
Okay. So, so you do this. I'm not sure there's an advantage to selling before you move to Puerto Rico, but okay.
I'm not saying there is. It's just just say there is, right?
Yeah, and then you happen to move to Puerto Rico and you buy a bunch of stuff, and and you wait 5 years or whatever. It doesn't matter. The point here is that if you're a resident of Puerto Rico, then the gain should be sourced to Puerto Rico, and the clear terms of the Internal Revenue Code 933 would exempt that from U.S. taxation, right? Because it's not U.S. source income. You have to read the source rules very carefully.
And now the question becomes, now would you have a deemed, so basically let's suppose you want to, now what we're talking about here is if you're exiting as U.S. person as a Puerto Rican bona fide resident. So what we're ending up here is we can't really tell you what the tax, not provisioning any other provision of this title, any gain rising from such sale shall be taken into account for the taxable year of the sale. So again, they're doing a deemed sale. Would a deemed sale apply to crypto owned by a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico?
Yeah, sure it would.
It would. Okay.
Of course it would, but it's just a question of whether it's taxable, right? Look, let's simplify this.
Okay.
Look, so we've got the person who moves to Puerto Rico. All right, bona fide resident, 10 years of gains. They actually sell. They're not going to be subject to U.S. taxation. Okay, at least that's my, I mean, I suggest, everybody should go over this, right? This is just my reading of this. I think it's right, but an expatriation is not an actual sale. It's a deemed sale, right? Now, the only point I'm making here is this: that if you actually read 877A, there's something in here that says, notwithstanding any other provision of this title. Now, Section 933 is part of the Internal Revenue Code. It's obviously a provision of the title. Any gain arising from sale shall be taken into account for the taxable year. Now, here's the thing, right? What does taken into account?
I know, right?
Does that mean, okay, it can mean two things. It can mean it's included in taxable income, or it could mean, yes, we recognize it, but we're going to treat it as sourced in Puerto Rico. So
Right.
okay, I don't know.
It can mean exactly both, right? That shall be taken into account. Okay, what does that mean? Oh,
Look, here's the bottom line, okay, for listeners. The bottom line, I don't know. Okay, I think that language there seems to me to be a bit of a warning sign, and I think that needs to be explored thoughtfully, over a period of time, and come to some reasonable, defensible conclusion on that, right?
mhm.
It does not say included in income. It says taken into account, right? I don't know what that means.
Whatever
In any
that means.
case, again, bottom line, because I know there's a lot of discussion of expatriation. One, the exit tax clearly would apply to gains that accrued before you were a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico.
Yes.
Whether it's a deemed sale or an actual sale. Two, if it's an actual sale, the gain would not be taxable. Okay, the gain that accrued while you were a resident of Puerto Rico would not be taxable. If it's a deemed sale under the expatriation rules, I don't know. It seems to me that you've got to take account of that bolded part there. What does it mean? I don't know. Okay, but I mean, you can well imagine, a bunch of Senate Democrats howling about this, saying, "Oh my God, no! How can we let people move to Puerto Rico, even if they really live there, and avoid the exit tax?
Right. Right. What if they're really living there? We still got to get them somehow, right?
Really living there, right?"
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a big issue, right?
Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna move on to tax. All right. Are we?
Here's where we are so far. We've talked about, or at least tried to talk about, uh, the non-taxation of Puerto Rican source income, the non-taxation by the United States of Puerto Rican source income for bona fide residents of Puerto Rico. Yes? Now, obviously, that's only a help to you if Puerto Rico doesn't come in and just, impose the same tax as the US.
Right.
And most people want to avoid taxes. Most people are not principled enough to say, well, I don't mind paying taxes, but I'd rather pick and choose what country I pay them to. That's not how most people think. Okay. Now, so what we have here, and I'm just going to gloss over this. We can do a separate discussion of this at some point. I don't know that it's worth it, but basically, you may have noticed all around the world that countries have put together incentives to attract people to live there. And what they often do, countries, Portugal, I think Italy has this. The UK has had the non-dom regime that they're getting rid of for years. They put together enticements. You come live here, and we're going to give you a certain tax break. Okay. So these Puerto Rican tax incentives, leaving aside the specifics, should just be thought of as Puerto Rico is trying to attract people with capital into the country, right? So what are they going to, here, going to make you a deal. You move to Puerto Rico, we're going to give you some tax breaks, okay? So what are those tax breaks? Next. So the tax breaks fall into really two categories. The first is for people who establish Puerto Rican companies. And, the bottom line is that U.S. has a corporate tax rate of 21%. Puerto Rico is going to have a tax rate of 4%. Seems like a lot less.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the caveat there, though, is that what they're not going to do is let somebody set up a company in Puerto Rico and give that person a lower tax rate than an established business in Puerto Rico that does the same thing, obviously, right? So, what they've done here is they say this applies for income earned offshore, right? Okay, non Puerto Rican income. So, what we have here, you can move IRS Medic to Puerto Rico, right?
Okay.
As long as you don't have Puerto Rican clients.
I don't.
All
Well, no,
right.
I only have a few. I only have a handful, but
You got to get rid of them.
yeah.
Okay.
All right. I'll tell them. Okay.
And all of your revenue is from outside Puerto Rico. It seems to me that you probably could avail yourself of this. So anyway, the first incentive, okay, operates on the level of a company. The second incentives, this is really pretty sweet, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Individuals who don't have companies. And there you have it. As I understand it, Puerto Rico source interest, dividends, and capital gains are not taxed. So where
Now,
are we then?
yeah.
Imagine a situation where, because you are a U.S. citizen, you get bona fide resident in Puerto Rico. U.S. won't tax you on your Puerto Rico source interest, dividends, and tax capital gains. And oh my God, is it true that Puerto Rico won't either? So, you create a situation of, this is obviously is very beneficial from a tax point of view. I'm not sure I've got it exactly right here because, as always, there's details and bells and whistles. But to understand the way this works, the way people leverage this is that they become bona fide residents of Puerto Rico to avoid U.S. taxation on Puerto Rico source income. They still have to pay tax on U.S. or other source income, etc. But surprisingly, Puerto Rico doesn't jump in and just sort of tax that up either, right? So that's the thought process behind this. There are obviously a lot of small details, bells and whistles that make this difficult to achieve. It may sound easy, but none of these things are ever easy. Um, there's a whole industry, people who advise on that. There's a link. I don't know if those people are lawyers or not, but it's a pretty decent summary of how it works. And Anthony, do you think the IRS would generally like this?
Well, I'm gonna surprise you, and I'm gonna say yes. And the reason why is because it adds so much confusion that could put someone and get bad advice, and now the IRS can come and terrorize them. So yes, the amount of confusion it creates, and that there's all these little tricks and people aren't paying attention to it. Ultimately, I think the IRS has said, "This is great. This is great. We have a whole bunch of people who we can ruin."
So it expands the penalty base, in other words.
Exactly. I would say that's really it because it expands the penalty base by offering a potential solution that is certainly a solution for some people. Don't get me wrong. But because it's so intricate and it's so hard to get these right and it's so hard to get advice, the chances of you creating creating a potential penalty bonanza for the IRS is just, it's too juicy for them to say, "Oh yeah, we like this." So I would, that's why I would give my answer, probably a contrarian answer that, "Oh no, the IRS loves this."
All
Yeah.
right, let's go to part 4 and see what's happening on that front.
All right. Part 4. Oh,
I don't really. I mean, I have no idea really what's going on in this space. I mean, I don't. Oddly enough, I just don't find this particularly interesting. But in any case, um, so there's an article in New York Times from May 28th, 2004. Go to the next slide. I provided a link to the article there. Anybody can go there. But basically, apparently some insiders are, I think this was actually a law firm, are pissed off that, certain Americans don't really meet the bona fide residence test and therefore are abusing the system. I don't know. Anyway, this is an area that I think is likely to get increased attention over the years. Uh, my interest in this is more that, I mean, if you were to say to a 5-year-old in a sandbox, you know, you got three kids in a sandbox. One of them stays put in the U.S. One of them moves to France and has to pay tax on French source income. The other moves to Puerto Rico and doesn't have to pay tax on Puerto Rican source income. I mean, it seems to me that there's a real, you know, this is evidence of a really, really, really messed up tax system. Okay.
Yeah, and you know, I think that I think what we see, what we see from the government is, they attack people they don't like. They've decided they don't like crypto investors because for some reason they appear to be a threat. The Roger Ver indictment, which we covered, is a perfect example of the IRS kind of inventing some facts that maybe don't appear to be there. It was a complicated case, and they're saying things that just don't seem to add up. So they would want to do that, and again, and here, you have a penalty exposure. You have a penalty exposure, and because the thing is let's consider if you did everything, you thought you were set, but you were actually only in Puerto Rico for 182 days. Now you can kind of see, then they say, actually, all your, everything becomes reportable, and any, you may have 5471 obligations. You may have so
You're
many
still gonna have all the reporting obligations, Anthony. Okay, this is it's like the foreign earned income exclusion. All it does is it allows exclusions from income. As far as I can see, it has no other impact at all on the Internal Revenue Code. And this is why renunciation is the option of choice, right? I mean, it's the only one that makes sense. Another way of looking at this that occurs to me is that I think from the U.S. point of view, or Treasury point of view, I think that they might think it would make sense to simply send the armed forces down to Puerto Rico because, and stop this, because they would regard, these Puerto Rican tax incentives as unfairly taking advantage of the U.S. tax code. Right, in the same way that Secretary Yellen, hated Ireland, for having for U.S. multinationals, the same reason they hated the Swiss banks, for providing banking service to Americans. I mean, anything that that hurts our revenue stream is bad. So maybe the result of this will simply be that the U.S. will just impose some sort of a penalty tax on the territory of Puerto Rico. That's territory, so we'll have to go after the individuals involved.
Yeah, you're right. How dare Puerto Rico?
All the revenue in Puerto Rico. I don't know. But anyway.
So yeah, and I would say this, I think it's right. It's not for everybody, but it could be for you. And I think, and I mean, I do see why a lot of crypto investors go down there. It makes sense, and there's a community down there. You like it. It fits your lifestyle. Fantastic. It is a beautiful island. I will say that it absolutely is. And this is go ahead, John.
I think it's a good option for people who don't want to renounce U.S. citizenship, right? Because if you
baby step, right?
If you go down there and you say, well, I mean, you've imprisoned yourself, right? So you have to stay there. But let's say that doesn't bother you. Okay, you go down there, and you can imprison yourself. You can say, my U.S. citizenship is so valuable to me that I'm going to imprison myself in Puerto Rico. When all I have to do is renounce it and be free.
Yeah, it might, it's right for some people, but don't look at it as like, but it might be right for you or wrong for you, but it probably won't be the halfway, like, well, I don't think there's a half measure. I don't see how that works. It would be really good for you or bad for you. Nah.
Yeah.
Indifferent.
So Anthony, in closing on this, I want to say the following. As I'm frequently finding myself saying, as these topics get more niche and more complex, get help. Okay. All I've done here is a broad overview today to sort of introduce the theory of how this works. Yeah. There's all kinds of stuff in the regulations and everything, to create hurdles. pitfalls, etc. So for God's sake, if you're going to do this, get help. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, and John, this is just sort of my concluding thoughts on this as I think about the American empire. I do think about this American empire, the federal government as the super state controlling all their states and having state interests, creating state rights, being its own state. How did this empire acquire Puerto Rico? Was it through, let's see here. Was it through a false flag created to put the U.S. in a phony war against Spain? Spain being poor, broke, not wanting a war. For some reason, as the story goes, Spain, a country that's weak, decided to blow up the boiler of the USS Maine. And that was given as the reason why the United States of America needed to go to Spain, a country that couldn't possibly benefit from a war with America, couldn't possibly benefit. But yet that is what happened. America went to war with Spain over a very convenient boiler explosion on the USS Maine. Really a lie. And it's been established that it is a lie. It was not Spain doing it. It was internal sabotage so that the United States of America and its bloodlust for more and more empire created a phony war, destroying many people, and then just sort of taking Puerto Rico as its possession, right? It's its possession, and isn't that sort of an interesting word, possession? And I think that's what they truly mean, and it really truly means here. So what we're seeing here is just the continued byproduct. And I think that's where we started today off talking about, the real American empire here, and how to hide an empire. And it's been hidden, but now I think what's happening is the tax code reveals it, though, right? That's sort of what we have here, that this horrible tax code reveals, as we've said before, the values of this country.
All you have to do to understand the values of a country is look at its tax code. Okay, that's all you have to do. And, we see this here. I mean, it's an interesting sort of tour through history. And I'm sure the U.S. government would probably describe the history of this as that, one day, Spain wanted to give a gift to the United States. They simply sent a diplomatic note saying, we're going to give you Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And I think there were other ones involved in that too. But I mean, of course, it was, but another thing that strikes me about this, right, is that, you look at the insular cases, and the root of these cases was that there were certain territories where there was no possibility of them sort of incorporating into the rest of the country, right? So these were non-incorporated, and this is totally based on racism. And I mean, unfortunately, so much of the history of this stuff is, as Justice Gorsuch points out in his dissent, is just based on racism, stereotyping, just unbelievable nonsense. And, so it is what it is. I mean, certainly the United States is not the only country at fault in this. I mean, Canada would be the same. I think that all extensions of the British Empire, basically have these problems in their history. But
it's
anyway,
it's not very pretty. So
the Puerto Rican tax thing is interesting. The way I would view it is this: are you willing to imprison yourself in Puerto Rico to remain a U.S. citizen? That's the question.
Beautifully said. Now, if you are looking for help, you're thinking about renouncing, what I would suggest is you reach out to the one and only John Richardson. Let me get his email up here. Here he is. And here's his email. You can reach out to him there at citizenshipsolutions@protonmail.com. Now, our great friend Keith Redmond did have to hop off the call. And if you are interested in being a part of this, learning more about the community and sort of be a topic of discussions, you can join Keith's Facebook group at American Expatriates, or you can follow us on Twitter if that's not exactly your thing. John and I and Keith are all on Twitter. You can find us there. So with that, I think we are going to conclude today's show. Thank you again, John. This has just been an incredibly sobering, but incredibly revealing podcast about the true empire of the world the United States of America, and one of the ways it exercises its tyranny with the thing it calls its tax code, but who knows what it really is. So with that, and by the way, and if you are looking, oh, by the way, if you are having an international tax issue, if you are being audited, by the way, the IRS is not auditing a ton, but who they're auditing is interesting. Or if you need an offshore disclosure, you can reach out to us at irsmedic.com/offshore. Or even if you are overseas, your due date for a tax return is coming up quickly. We can get an extension for you. You can also get your tax prep done with us here as well. Just go to irsmedic.com/offshore and book a time to speak with us. With that, I want to so go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think just sort of closing word here. I actually find the history of this far more interesting than the tax issue. And I really recommend, either read the book Empire or watch his interview with Democracy Now! But, for those who are maybe a little more academically inclined, that article by Francine Lippman, Professor Lippman, it's just, a fantastic blending of tax law and history that you'll rarely see. So there you go.
And I think this is the question that I'm thinking about right now that you just made me think of. And let's see here. Hopefully I don't have this right here. What do you give up when you join an empire?
Everything.
Yeah. Your soul, your humanity, everything.
Well, that's like asking, what do you give up by being a U.S. citizen, right? And I've really come to see that the great powers, in a very real sense, have to abuse their citizens because, they have to be able to sort of consolidate them in terms of sort of a common purpose. And the purpose of all U.S. citizens is to, aid the government in waging war on the world in some way or another. U.S. citizens move to another country, they erode the tax base of those other countries. I think that the U.S. government should keep track of how much every U.S. citizen abroad has eroded the tax base of their country of residence and give them awards every 2 years or something. Help us out of Canada.
This is some spicy truth here. I always appreciate it, John. Thank you so much for enlightening us all. This is Anthony Parent for Keith Redmond, John Richardson. Be sure to subscribe, turn on those notifications so you know when we go live. Thanks again for watching.